This video is brought to you by the Native Oak and has been sponsored by Keeps.
I have a rather tricky question for you all. What is a woman, and what are they good for? Well, if you're a fan of the Patriot, it's possible, just possible, that you have a rather interesting way of answering that question. Because while a young man like myself may not pick up on exactly how warped the film's portrayal of women is right off the bat, once you dig past that initial layer of, oh, it's just entertainment, don't think so hard about it, well, once again, you'll find a strange, antiquated, and honestly rather disturbing view not only of early America, like we explored in the racism video, but also just of humanity itself. And already I can hear the comments from individuals who have such rage in the world that they'll refuse to even watch this video before coming to the conclusion that I'm a soy boy libcuck who just doesn't understand, doesn't have enough testosterone to know that women are objects.
Well, let's just say hypothetically, okay, what if they have a good personality?
Whereas those who are more balanced will at least have made it this far into the video to hear the following disclaimer. I am far from the sort of person to cry sexism or misogyny at the drop of a hat. I don't much engage myself with matters of sexuality and gender and all the rest. Half the time I think the conversation is a little silly, and that all the different sides are getting far too angry over nothing in particular. Not to say that there aren't plenty of important conversations to be had, of course. I just see things being taken rather too far, rather too often, is all.
For example, a film like Master and Commander not having any female characters in it really isn't a big deal to me. It'd only be a problem if the setting actually called for women to be present and then they were pointedly left out.
But all the same, much as I said with the racism review, sometimes movies are actually offensive, and glaringly enough so that I find it difficult to not notice. So, with all that out of the way, let us commence with the fourth installment of our glorious crusade against Farbury and talk about how The Patriot is honestly just outright sexist.
The Bechdel test is an interesting measure regarding whether a film features at least two women who talk to each other about something other than a man. Bonus points if those characters actually have names. The Patriot features a number of women. In order of appearance, they are the slave. I mean, of course, the totally free worker whose loving devotion to the Martin children makes her the closest they have to a mother figure at the film's start. Although I won't be talking about her in this video, really, because as a black woman, more was to be said about her in the first part of this review, where we talked about racism and race relations in the 18th century and all that kind of thing. Then there's the wife, who's been dead since 1773. There's Cleavage, the dead wife's sister, and also a wealthy plantation owner. After the slave is kidnapped for literally no reason by the British Army, she's the one who takes the children into her care and has her house burned by the baddies to lure out her brother-in-law, to whom she is also the love interest. Yeah, it gets pretty weird. And Padme, who falls in love with Martin's son Joker after about 2 conversations, then she gives a speech, gets married, and then suffers a fate second only in pain to having to watch this film over and over again for your YouTube review series.
Hi everyone, so it's Editor Brandon here. I just had a realization. Natalie Portman's not in this movie. Not at all. Never was, never has been, and according to my girlfriend at least, looks nothing at all like the actress from the movie. I thought they looked kind of similar. For some reason I had it in my head when I was writing the script that they are the same. Kind of funny actually that I made a stupid mistake like that in a video talking about sexism in film and everything, and I couldn't tell two women apart, but anyways, kind of an L on my part. I refer to this woman as Padme for pretty much the entire video, but it's not. Hey, in my defense, both characters are very poorly written, basically are only there so they can die to advance someone else's plot, and I don't know, they both look pretty, I guess. Does that, if I compliment it? No, that kind of makes it worse, actually, because I'm complimenting their appearance, not their acting skill. Oh, God. All right, just moving on. I'm sorry. Oh, God.
And then there are also the children, but I spoke about them a lot in the second part of this review, and there isn't really much more to say about them. I also won't cover them in this video because they're kids. I feel like they're kind of their own category, separate from adult women, not the least of which because they aren't sexual agents in the film, and as such their sexuality and how they use their gender to navigate their environment really isn't a part of their character at all. So, in a weird way, as you'll see, this kind of actually makes the two little girls the most well-developed female characters in the entire film. Or, well, maybe not well-developed, but at the very least, the least offensive ones. And of course, there are also a number of fascinating side characters, including but not limited to the redhead, who looks at her husband and then dies. The other wife, who jokes about how her and her husband once had sex before marriage, and then dies. And of course, who could forget the fan favorite, the lady who watches a munition ship explode, likely killing or mutilating at least a dozen people, and thinks it's part of a fireworks display. Oh yes, everyone, it is quite the all-star cast. So what about that Bechdel test? Does the film pass? Yeah, I don't think that the answer is terribly surprising there. I mean, unless we want to count things like this.
You're safe now. Try to sleep.
Night.
Good night.
But that's an incredibly short, throwaway line between one of the female leads and the kids, so I don't think that particularly counts. In fact, before making this video, I made sure to watch the entire film multiple times, in which I took notes on literally every instance of a woman or girl appearing in the entire thing. And by my count, this is the only time that one woman says to, well, and again, in this case, a girl, not another woman, something that doesn't directly relate to men. Of course, there are other moments that women will interact with each other in the film, and maybe, just maybe, they aren't talking about their love lives or their kids, but unfortunately, we never actually get to hear any of it. For example, here, when Joker walks up to Padme at a rally. She's pretty engrossed in conversation with her mother, but we don't actually hear anything of that conversation. There's literally no audio, even though we can hear her father's speech pretty clearly, despite it being much further away. We only actually get audio to this particular space once Joker interrupts her, and suddenly we can hear clear as day over top of the background. Now, look, this is the 18th century. The interaction that we just watched really isn't out of place. I'm not saying that the film is sexist because a conversation was interrupted. That would be ridiculous. If you want to argue, yes, that was a sexist thing to do, Joker assuming that his presence was more important than allowing Padme to, finish her sentence with her mother, well, that's well and all fine. That's fine. But it's a kind of sexism that is hardly out of place in a portrayal of the 18th century. There's a vitally important distinction to be made between the film showing historical sexism and the modern media itself being sexist. My point here is that while we hear all sorts of background jumble and other audio, the only thing that there is literally zero audio of is the conversation between the two women. It's an incredibly minor and brief moment, but it does demonstrate the filmmakers' priorities in what they want the audience to be taking in. And the filmmakers made a pointed decision here that the audience wouldn't be, or perhaps shouldn't be, interested in what the women have to say up until a man enters the scene. All right, I know, I'm looking way too far into this. It really isn't that big of a deal. Well, you know what? Neither were a lot of the points that I made in my racism video up until you see them all together. Now, I will admit, yes, this one instance really doesn't matter in a vacuum. But keep watching this video and see if by the end of it all, you don't see a very clearly established pattern. But in any case, this is one of the few instances in which we see two women speaking with one another at all, even though we gain zero insight into the experience of womanhood during this time period through it. So does it count for the Bechdel test? I think not.
But why should we care? Not every story has to have women as its main characters, no more than every story has to be about men. Like I mentioned earlier, Master and Commander absolutely fails the Bechdel test. Heck, the only time we even see a woman in that entire film is in a very clearly sexualized context, and a colonialist one to boot. Oh, talk about the opportunities to flex those buzzwords. So, what's the difference? Why does one film's completely failing the Bechdel test matter, while the other doesn't?
Context. Not every film has to have women in an important role. Master and Commander, as a film, literally has no room for deeper female representation unless it was shoehorned in. But if your film does include female characters, if it gives them names and lines and makes them a part of the plot, then absolutely it does have a duty to make sure those characters are actual characters, to give them motivations and purpose, a background, and some sense of humanity. Not to treat people as props, as objects to be used by other characters to further their own plot lines. Within the story itself, absolutely that can happen.
I haven't been happy since I married my first husband. Men and women use and abuse each other all the time. There's nothing wrong with it.
But the writing itself cannot be abusive. The writing itself cannot treat people in that way. At the very least, it can't do so and expect to be taken seriously. And as we shall see, literally all of the women in this film serve no purpose of their own, hold no aspirations or objectives of their own, or even honestly, even have any opinions of their own half the time, except as expressly serves the interests of and drives the plot for the men of the film, and particularly their romantic interests. But before we get into the really juicy stuff, it's time for a word from our sponsor.
The following message is sponsored by Keeps. Oh, I wonder who that is. Dear heavens! Well, hello, good sir. Have I the miracle products for you today?
Who are you?
Dr. Xavier Montcalm III, PhD of Humoral Arts from a very real university at your service, my dear boy.
How did you get into my home?
Immaterial. Suffer you from toothworms, melancholia, or inflammation? Well, I've the cure for you here and now for a low, low price. The cure is leeches and opium.
What? No, none of that. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave.
But sir, have you considered that 2/3 of men will experience hair loss by the time they turn 35? Why, just a little bit of bleeding and I could...
Oh, well, thanks for the offer, but I'm good. I have a plan through keeps.com/BrandonF. They offer clinically proven, research-backed treatments to help improve my hair growth and stop loss. And, you know, it doesn't involve leeches.
And opium.
Or opium. Keeps plans are doctor recommended at half the cost of traditional pharmacy, and I can get their care at home without ever having to visit a doctor's office. And they definitely don't crash through my door like you just did.
Oh, sure, you know, everyone seems to hate how I break down their doors up until they need my assistance. But when they have those inevitable questions about my highly complicated procedures
Of leeches and...
of leeches and opium, yes, well then they're downright pleased to have me breaking through their doors and sometimes windows.
Well, if I ever have any issues, then Keeps offers 24/7 care and support.
I get unlimited messaging access to their network of expert medical advisors, prescribers, and care specialists. Huh. Well, that may be, but what does such extraordinary luxury cost you and your fancy technology, eh? A real arm and a leg, I bet, and I should know I've removed an awful lot of them.
Not at all, actually. I just went to keeps.com/BrandonF and I was able to get 50% off my first order.
You just had to visit keeps.com/BrandonF for a whole 50% off your first order?
Yeah, that's right.
Wow!
Yeah, so, can you leave now?
What? Oh, right. Yes, sorry about that. I'll just head out through the hole.
Through the hole in the wall. Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you to keeps.com/BrandonF for sponsoring this video. Let's start by looking at cleavage, aka Aunt Charlotte. As an unmarried and highly wealthy landowner, she represents something of a rare exception to the general condition of her sex during the 18th century. She owns a home in Charlestown alongside a massive plantation in the countryside. She also owns many people, incidentally, with a significant workforce of slaves to act as her servants, laborers, and all the like. A significant number of those slaves are even children, who are particularly expensive considering that they require upkeep but provide inherently less labor than adults. The only real reason to keep them around is to ensure the future of the plantation as a form of generational wealth, although it sounds really gross to say it that way.
Not only does all this mean that she is an exception to the norm, it also means that she has an awful lot invested in the political and commercial climate of her colony. Few people, and certainly no other characters in this film aside from Mel Gibson, have anywhere near as much to lose or potentially gain from the prospect of war with Great Britain. And all of that provides the basis for a fascinating character, well-informed and politically savvy with all sorts of social connections and resources at her disposal. A woman who is fiercely independent after having to justify her existence against the backdrop of a society that is dominated in a very literal, legal sense by men. So, what do we actually get? Well, it isn't that.
Our very first introduction to Cleavage sees her house slave inform.
Children are here.
Naturally, the first thing that she does is move over to the mirror to check how she looks before the children swarm around her and we get this delightfully awkward moment.
They're huge. What have you been feeding them?
Well, they're from good stock. On their mother's side, of course.
And if that wasn't enough for awkwardness, after Cleavage excitedly tells the kids that she has gifts for them, the two older kids, just oh so excited at the prospect of presents, take off running into the home with such gusto that they end up pushing Gibson into Cleavage.
Yeah, given their reactions, I'm thinking that was the most sexually exciting moment that either of them have had in many years.
And lastly, a special gift for the little girl, and we have solidly established that Charlotte is the new mother figure. This might have been a good chance for the two women here to speak with each other about something other than a romantic interest, even if it would have been about the state of the children, which would probably hardly matter as far as Bechdel is concerned. But instead, the two ladies hardly even look at each other. Cleavage's next scene is probably her greatest moment as an independent character with at least 2 brain cells, as Joker runs up and explains that South Carolina's governor is threatening to disband the local legislature. She provides a piece of political insight, telling the audience exactly what this means and why it's important, which makes sense that she has concerns about all this, given what we mentioned earlier about her status and her financial interests, to say nothing of the danger and the opportunities both that are provided by revolution to her personally.
Wouldn't that force our delegates in Philadelphia to vote for independence?
Yes.
However, it's also important to note that this insight doesn't come as just pure explanation or exposition. It isn't Charlotte, expounding on what this might mean for her family, for the colony. Rather, it's coming as a question, which she directs to Mel, obviously. I mean, this is kind of a really big deal for her. Her fate is about to be decided on by a political body that she has zero say in. It'd be a great moment to expound on what she must be thinking about all of this, but we get nothing from her. We're just meant to guess at her thoughts through these little blank, vague stares, while literal pandemonium is happening right outside of her door.
For a woman whose face is being illumined by bonfires and burning effigies to calls for murder, she's awfully unreacted. A little concern? Hello? Well, anywho, Charlotte offers up another piece of political info, but it doesn't have anything to do with her. It's about the expectations the colonel's going to have for Gibson to enlist. And while that's happening, we hear a crash from inside the home, to which Cleavage just laughs as if it were some lighthearted jape that a piece of her property was just destroyed.
I mean, sure, it may have been some emotionally significant piece of artwork or a valuable place setting, a flipping window, but no, we'll just laugh it off. Use it as another great example, another excuse to mention how Charlotte is going to be the new mommy figure.
They have long needed a woman in their lives. Mother.
I mean, heaven forbid, of course, that we see a woman be anything more than slightly miffed, unless, of course, it's directly in support of a man. From there we leave Cleavage, save for the occasional glance at her big scared doe eyes while the men discuss the prospect of civil war, and then after a time skip we learn through a letter from Joker that she was indeed forced to flee the city and her residence there.
We spoke about how stupid this particular scene was during the racism video.
Cleavage's next major appearance in the film comes after the Martin family farm is destroyed as a bloodied Gibson with children in tow flees to her estate for shelter.
We get this just spectacular moment of acting
You're safe now. Try to sleep.
before the real purpose of Charlotte's character really begins to shine as a figure of comfort for the main character.
She ensures him that he did nothing wrong, despite probably having no idea what actually happened.
You've done nothing for which you should be ashamed.
Later, while Gibson's brooding at the fireplace, Charlotte appears with tea. Not, one of the house slaves, but the mistress of the home herself.
Oh, and also she's wearing a different dress now? Why?
No, nobody knows. Anyways, the son comes in to explain he's going back out to war, to which Charlotte offers,
Gabriel.
and then proceeds to say nothing and just stand in the background for the rest of the scene, although she does look longingly up at Gibson at one point. The next morning, Mel is riding off after his son to go fight those evil British and moving down the line from kid to kid saying his goodbyes.
Although, funnily enough, we seem to have skipped over the eldest daughter. I guess that goodbye just wasn't really heartfelt enough. Mel didn't have any lasting words of wisdom for the eldest daughter like he does for literally all of the other kids. Again, it's a tiny thing. It's a really small matter, but definitely an active choice by the filmmakers here on what perspectives they thought that we as the audience would be interested in, what perspectives were important to tell for the story. We have to listen to the stupid kid go, "When are you going to come back, Dad? Tomorrow?" "No, you moron, I'm not going to come back tomorrow. He's going to war." That was very, very important, but the eldest daughter, man, I'm sure she'll be fine. She doesn't have any worries or concerns about any of this. It's just another day for her.
Finally, we come to Cleavage herself, the aunt's now turned fully into the maternal figure as she is left with the kids. Once again, we have a fantastic moment here for some characterization as she's left with this massive responsibility, watching her dead sister's kids while the father rides off into the maelstrom of war, not necessarily going to be returning, but she literally says nothing the entire time. Even after he rides away, nothing. Although she does have a very long blink right here, and sometimes you can see that she moves her mouth a little bit. So definitely a very, very interesting perspective on her inner monologue. We just don't get to hear that monologue. The next time we get to see Cleavage is when Marshal Zhukov attacks and burns her estate. Now get ready, everyone, because this is about to be the pinnacle of acting. The older boy spots the approaching troops and wakes Cleavage, who wasn't wearing a nightgown or other underclothes for sleeping, but a very full and very formal-looking dress with perfect hair and makeup. Just like how all women sleep after having majestically slipped into a blissful slumber while reading a book, probably about feminine virtue or something. She sees the cavalry wielding torches, and with full knowledge of what happened at her brother's farm, mainly that it was burnt to the ground while his unarmed son alongside a whole slew of wounded men were murdered in cold blood, and this is how she reacts.
Get the boys. Margaret, come quickly. This way.
I mean, sure, yes, she's taking charge here, and she's leading the kids to safety. So that's genuinely a mark in her favor as a strong character that isn't totally useless like pretty much every other woman in this film. Is it fair for me to mock the actress's dramatic skill in a video about the film's sexism? Maybe not. But then, maybe the relatively flat acting here, alongside her relative lack of screen time, does actually speak to the lack of breadth of acceptable female emotion that this film provides. They're allowed to be upset, yes, but never too upset as to detract from their appearance or our overall impression of them.
I mean, heck, if any scene is going to belong to Charlotte, really be an opportunity for her to flex her acting chops, as it were, well then this would be the one. But instead, we have just as much, if not more, screen time being paid to Tavington and the son here, and the real moment of tension is between them, while Charlotte and the rest of the little ones are just hiding down below. Well, in any case, as they make their escape, we see Cleavage's slaves being shot and her home burned, her entire livelihood, her way of existence being destroyed right in front of her eyes while she watches on mercilessly, and up until Gibson arrives, with no guarantee that they won't be taken prisoner or just outright shot as well. Or potentially even worse, as the son, really weirdly alluded to earlier in the film. And again, what's the reaction that we get? It's just another flat stare. So the lady is turned refugee, and as she is brought to the Maroon colony by Joker, incidentally, why is she and the youngest kid the ones who are walking when the two older boys are on horseback? We get another dramatic yet meaningless line which provides, you guessed it, no genuine context or insight into anything at all that she might be thinking.
They won't stop looking for us.
Okay? We have a similar level of insightful inner commentary when Cleavage is brought to her new quarters, if only we could actually hear that commentary. The scene has an awful lot of baggage that's entirely neglected by the film, but I discuss it at length in the racism video, so we can move on from here. Long story short, she's way too okay with this entire situation than she probably should be. Again, she's not allowed to be that upset because it might mar that pretty face. Later, the Martins are able to visit the family to be greeted by another meaningless one-liner and nothing else.
My God, they're huge. What have you been feeding them?
They're from good stock on their father's side.
And later on, Gibson wakes up in the middle of the night to this, which can only feel horribly out of place because of how little actual romantic buildup we've had through this entire film. The foundation of this relationship is based off of nothing more than one-liners and sexual tension. There is zero reason for us as an audience to think that this is anything other than weird and uncomfortable. Unless, of course, we simply accept the fact that the attractive woman is obliged to fall in love with our protagonist, even when there's literally no reason for it, no story behind it whatsoever. I mean, come on, people. You don't have to be Jane Austen to realize that this woman would have had plenty of suitors practically breaking down her door, and yet we're meant to believe that she just has maintained this single life all this time, not because she preferred the single life, not because it allowed her to maintain her property, whereas if she got married, it would have been her husband's property, including her. None of that. She was just waiting for the right man, who just so happens to be her old brother-in-law. Well, anyways, plenty more awkward staring and will they, won't they nonsense with the narrative subtlety of that immolation scene from Schindler's List. Until eventually, of course, we come to the romantic beach getaway scene. What every epic historical war film needs. Am I right, ladies and gentlemen? And of course it comes complete with possibly the most poorly written line in the entire film.
May I sit with you?
It's a free country. Or at least it will be. It's a free country.
No.
You're a woman! No need to elaborate there. Anyways, they stare at each other a bit more before... I'm not my sister. I know that. Do you? Yes, I do. Very well, then. Well? Well, what? And then the long-awaited kiss. Oh, how romantic and sweet and honestly just weirdly out of place. Again, nothing to actually reinforce this relationship beyond the trope that the leading lady has to fall in love with, or at least be sexually submissive to, the leading man. And now they're a couple, I guess. Yay, celebration, woo, good for them. So Mel rides off again the next morning, we get more war stuff, and at long last, at the film's end, we have Cleavage's last appearance. First reading out Gibson's letter home to the kids, although it's in his voice so we don't actually hear her, before finally coming home to the estate being newly rebuilt. I know it's well tired by this point, but again, I can only encourage you to consider what wide range of emotions must be necessary in a scene like this. All of these men, just peasants compared to how Charlotte used to live, are coming together to help rebuild her life with her new family after so much trauma, after so much struggle. I said new family, they're kind of her old family, new and old, I don't know, it's like a new used car, it's her new used family. And what we get is 2 blank stares. That's it. We don't even get to see her face after this point. We get a shot of her chest, and then of her waist, and then of her back, but not of her face. Nor does she get any spoken lines. The very last time we see her face is when she's carrying the new baby. So, by the end of it all, what exactly was Charlotte's character arc? How did she, as a character, progress and change as a result of all of these horrific and life-altering experiences? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? Because from what I can tell, there was exceedingly little, if any, character growth beyond the fact that she fell in love with her dead sister's husband. While she was on camera, she barely spoke, and what lines she did have were incredibly short and generally didn't mean much. All of her worldly possessions were destroyed or taken from her, as she and the children under her care were turned into refugees in their own country. But this seemingly had little impact on her as a character, and we never really see her make any fuss about anything at all at any point. Charlotte was an exception for so many rules of the 18th century. She was a single, wealthy, landowning woman. But the filmmakers, it would seem, were only interested in 2 of those traits, her being a single woman. They could have used Charlotte as a fascinating look into the world of the 18th century and of the war's impact on civilians. They could have used her as a person, with her own personality and character traits, her own interests and desires. But the most we ever really saw of Charlotte were those womanly traits of sexuality and motherhood. A bit of a strange combination when you think about that way, isn't it? Oh, but of course Charlotte wasn't the only woman in this film. She just happens to be the most well-developed and interesting one of them all. God help us. Padme, otherwise known as Anne, is the daughter of a local merchant. And unlike Charlotte, she isn't exceptional in any way, especially in the script, where she represents an even worse character than the last, impressively so. She's the love interest to Mel's son, the Joker, and quite literally her entire character arc consists of the following steps. She falls in love, and then she dies. The first time we see Padme is in that aforementioned rally when Gabriel sneaks up behind her. She deftly cuts through his little ruse, trying to play coy, hoping she may not remember that he teased her as a kid.
The last time you saw me, I was 11, and you put ink in my tea.
Oh, I believe that was one of my younger brothers, perhaps Samuel or Nathan.
It was you, and it turned my teeth black for a month.
This is a brief interaction, and truly it serves no purpose other than to establish that these two have a bit of history, and that clearly there is at least a little bit of mutual affection there. You can see the little smile towards the end. Padme's affections are confirmed as she looks on admiringly while the young gallant enlists with the rebel army. She doesn't say anything, of course, or really betray any emotion whatsoever. She just gazes on, looking pretty. Shocking, I know. Padme then disappears for just under an hour in the film, reappearing when Joker is recruiting for Gibson's new militia. He saunters into the church, knowing well enough at least to remove the cover from his head, but apparently too stupid to realize that maybe a church isn't the best place to bring a firearm. Anyways, after interrupting the service, he seems pretty good at interrupting, isn't he? He tries his best to recruit the locals. But they just don't seem terribly eager. They're muttering to themselves, casting eyes aside, at which point the preacher points out, rightfully so I'd say, that this is a house of God, and that maybe this isn't the best time? But we're not talking about the warped theology of this film. That'll be for another day. Point is, townspeople aren't having it. Until, of course, Padme comes in to... well, not really to save the day, but to convince them all to go off to war.
Half the men in this church, including you, Father, and you, Reverend, are as ardent patriots as I. Will you now, when you are needed most, stop at only words? Is that the sort of men you are? I ask only that you act upon the beliefs of which you have so strongly spoken.
You know, for someone who doesn't actually have to go, she's speaking very, very fiercely about all these principles, isn't she?
She calls out the men for their hypocrisy in establishing herself in the process as a strong-willed and courageous woman. My, could this be an actual female character instead of just a prop? A woman with passion and purpose beyond simply getting the man?
Well, no. Shockingly, not at all. This is not only Padmé's first meaningful dialogue, it's also her last, by far. She never gets this many lines in the film again, nor does she ever speak of anything else beyond her relationship status after this point. And it certainly doesn't help matters that this entire speech wasn't sourced in her own character's interests. Rather, it's just in support of her love interest. It's not anything to do with her, it's to do with the man.
From here, it's pretty much just a lot of sexualization and using Padmé as a deliciously blank slate upon which the audience may draw up whatever strange colonial good old days fantasies that they may have. Starting pretty much right off the bat with this moment right here.
To write me.
Write her.
Yes, sir.
Very well.
Okay, so like, I don't want to be the weird one here, but I mean, did the father just make a joke about, like, riding his dog? But at least we move quickly past that to see Padmé for the second time staring off lovingly at her man as he rides away, again with that beautifully blank expression. About 5 minutes later, in film time of course, we have a montage of the militia picking off regular troops. And towards the end, Joker is writing a love letter to Padmé, in which we flash between the two would-be lovers, one sitting under a tree, and the other walking through a field of flowers and smelling the letter while a butterfly flutters around her. Oh my god, they're not even trying with this one, are they? Well, Gabriel promises to return to her, and eventually he gets the chance as the militia are stopping in town to resupply. Ready for more awkward sex jokes? Well, of course you are. Padmé is sitting at her writing desk when the men arrive, and a nervous, innocent smile spreads across her face as she sees Joker come to the front gate. And naturally, she runs and hides around the corner. Because she's a strong and independent adult, you know, like we saw earlier. Anyways, we get another haha funny joke.
I've come to call on Anne.
Well, of course you call yourself a man.
The two lovebirds are reunited, sharing a smile while staring into the camera wordlessly. Again. Next, Padmé's mother is busy at work sewing Gabriel into his bundling bag as the two are about to spend the night. And this is one of the things that I actually mentioned in my part 0 of the review series as something that was really cool. Shows just how much potential films like this have at demonstrating historical cultures, if only they actually bother to try. In this case, bundling was a practice in certain parts of America, which would allow young couples to spend the night together in private while preventing sexual contact between the two. That was the idea, at least. This could even include, as we see here, literally sewing the man inside of his little bundle to make sure that he couldn't get too handsy. The job done, the parents retire. Padmé gets her revenge for the tea trick, and the two share a cute little moment together, and then we swap over to the parents for our next sexual reference.
Peter, don't worry. I sew better than my mother did.
I hope so.
Incidentally, this is the only time that we get a discernible line of dialogue from Padmé's mother, despite her being on screen quite a number of times up to this point. And of course, it's to make a joke about how her and her husband had premarital sex. Haha, very funny. The next time that we see her making a noise is when she's burning to death. No, in fact, no, she doesn't make any noise when she's burning to death. That's just Padmé crying. Okay, so that's the only thing that we hear from her is a sex joke. The next morning, the two share their kiss goodbye, inky teeth revealing that perhaps they got up to a little bit more than just chatting, but of course with no dialogue being spoken by Padmé whatsoever. And you know what? If all of those wonderful experiences aren't enough to just know that you're destined to be with a woman for the next
Well, it turns out to be like 2 days. Well, then I don't know what is. The next time we see Padme is when on Gabriel's calling, she suddenly shows up at the Maroon colony with her family so the two can get married. Again, the stupidity of this entire arrangement is something that I went over in the racism video. Alongside a whole bunch of black people serving as nothing more than props for this scene, the wedding ceremony features an awful lot of staring, a single "I will" from both parties, a kiss, and then it moves swiftly on to the Ewok dance party, during which Gibson bestows his very temporary daughter-in-law with his wife's old necklace. Of course, he gets a whole monologue about the North Star being important or something or other, but Padme only gets a very select few words.
I'd be honored.
The next morning, the newlyweds kiss again, and the men ride off. At least this time we don't get a longing stare, at least not as much. And finally, everybody's favorite scene, as the Amidala's head back home, they are greeted by those dastardly British soldiers. Zukov locks all the people up in the church, burns it to the ground. Padme's last words, other than screaming and crying while she's burnt to a crisp?
He brings them to Black Swamp.
He's a liar!
You damn in the marsh.
fool.
And oh, I feel just so much sadness and pity for such a well-developed character. Oh, woe to the world for having lost such a flower of youth and beauty. And that's really about it.
Yeah, like I said, this entire character is even less developed than Charlotte, and that's impressive. She's as close to a blank slate as you can really get. She's given these vague little glimpses that maybe she's a bit more independent, kind of has a sarcastic side to her, maybe that she even has ideas of her own. Shocking, I know. But none of it's elaborated on. None of it ever leads to anything meaningful outside of shaming the men to go to war. Once again, as a character, Padme serves no function, no purpose of her own. Rather, her entire existence is merely to promote the interests and the story of her male counterpart. And to think that these two characters represent the women who are the most developed and the most relevant to the plot. They're as close as we get in this film to a decent portrayal of womanhood during the 18th century. Yikes, like big yikes. But at the same time, there are also a number of more minor female characters in The Patriot, and I figure that if we want to really get a complete picture of how the film treats women, well, then it's important that we talk about some of them as well.
Although now that I think about it, referring to these individuals as actual characters might be a little much. Let's take this one for example. I think her name is Martha. She's this guy's wife. You may remember him as the man who joked about killing people and eating dogs, so we're supposed to relate to him as a salt of the earth kind of guy. During one of the multitude goodbye scenes in the film.
God, there really are a lot of these. I feel like there are more shots of the men riding off to war than there are shots of them actually being in the war.
During the goodbye, we see the man giving a toy pistol to his son.
Oh, how deliciously ironic.
He sets him on a wagon, looks at his wife, says her name,
Martha.
and then they ride off. She doesn't say anything, she just kind of glances at him. The man says something after his boy to look after the mother, but nothing further to the wife. So overall, this scene, and the wife and kid on the whole as characters, serve zero purpose whatsoever except as a cheap way to reflect some vague and generalized example of humanity onto the man. And the next time we see her, oh no, oh tragedy, oh I felt so attached to these two with their combined personality equivalent to a plank of wood. They were killed by those dastardly British, oh emotions, sadness.
Feel sad. The movie is telling you you have to feel sad right now.
It's all just too much for our hero who shoots himself. I think it's meant to be an impactful scene. I think we're supposed to feel something here. I'm not quite sure.
God, even the blasted close-up completely ignores the dead wife in favor of showing the kid. They really screwed her over on this one, didn't they? Wow.
So that's another woman out of the way whose entire story arc was, look at husband, get shot. Another great example of women acting as props would be at the party scene where Gibson and his cronies somehow managed to sneak on board a supply ship and silently blow it up. Yeah, it's a really stupid scene, so I'll probably make a video about that one in future. But as the ship explodes in a horrendous fireball, likely resulting in the very painful deaths of, I don't know, like at least a dozen people probably, the result is...
Fireworks, lovely. Yes, oh Christos, you just can't make it up, can you? You can't make it up.
And she isn't the only prop here either, as the two young ladies with dashing old Zhukov just kind of stand there. They're only thinly intrigued by the whole affair. The film is littered with things like this, of course. Those two are just the most noteworthy cases by far. There are plenty of women in the film, to be sure, but none of them serve any actual function or seem to have any level of actual personality. They're just props more than they are characters. And on a similar note, it may also be worthwhile to point out the relative lack of women in particular settings which, had women been present, even only as props, it really would have gone a much further way towards building up this cultural sense of the 18th century and the role and status of women within it, and how different women in different, aspects of society would again use their gender, their sexuality, and things like that to navigate their world. There's a lot of really interesting avenues to potentially explore, but it's just completely ignored. For example, we see genteel women at the party, but in the film's tavern scene, there's only 2 women present. One walks by with a man in a jug, while the other slaps a man aside, telling him to keep his hands off. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of men sitting around and drinking and just kind of being sad. I think in the entire thing, there's just a surprising lack of motion, a surprising lack of character in the scene compared with what it could have been. I mean, there are so many amazing tavern scenes from this time period, and you might be surprised by just how mixed those settings could be in terms of sex. Men and women both, gambling and drinking, playing instruments, and canoodling, of course, chasing after each other, consent being a little blurred in some of those images. But my point is that these scenes can get raucous, whether you're portraying the upper class, middle class, or lower class, whatever it is. Now, obviously, yes, a lot of this might be artistic exaggeration, but I mean, still, just looking at how the Patriot portrays their tavern scene versus how actual people in the 18th century portrayed them, I feel like there's a bit of a missed opportunity here, and a big part of that is the lack of women, and a lack of them acting just as bad as the men are. Other great examples of scenes that could have been dramatically improved in terms of their visual variety and their material culture, again, like if nothing else, would have been any of the ones featuring military encampments. On very rare occasions, you'll see women in the background, but only ever incredibly briefly, usually blurred and distant. Much like in the tavern, if you blink, you'll miss them. And of course, for the British encampments, they're always 100% military, never any women in sight whatsoever, at least not that I could tell. Whereas, again, look at pretty much like any period artwork, both peacetime and in war, and you will oftentimes see women involved to some degree or other. Women not only followed the armies in which their husbands fought, they also worked for those armies, doing things like laundering clothes, a task for which they were paid an army wage. They were very much a vital part of military infrastructure and were an integral, if often separate, part of military camps right alongside male civilians who were serving as drivers, for example. In any case, all that could well be a video on its own in the future. I just thought that I'd mention it here. In the end, regardless of where you look, the majority of women in this film serve zero narrative function of their own. The most impact that they ever have is as a mere prop, used to advance other people's plot lines, and otherwise to simply decorate a set and make it look prettier. And even in those environments where women would be welcomed to help decorate the set, they would add a greater sense of the 18th century, well, then they're usually sorely lacking, weirdly enough. The film, to put it simply, just doesn't seem interested in portraying women as anything other than objects. And with that in mind, let us move on to the final chapter as we look at some of the interesting choices, those choice decisions on the part of the filmmakers.
Cassandra woke up to the rays of the sun streaming through the slats on her blinds, cascading over her naked chest. She stretched, her breasts lifting with her arms as she greeted the sun. She rolled out of bed and put on a shirt, her nipples prominently showing through the thin fabric. She breasted boobily to the stairs, and titted downwards.
Undoubtedly, there are those who are offended at the fact that I have referred to Charlotte as Cleavage rather than using her actual name. That was the point, after all, but rather than get angry with me, I would recommend that you direct your anger to the filmmakers, because honestly, with the level of writing and attention that's paid to her in this film, alongside how they actually shot her, it really doesn't strike me that the filmmakers cared much about the poor actress beyond that particular trait of hers.
For example, when her face is obscured in shadow, but a brilliant ray of moonlight falls cascading over her heaving bosom. And oh, is it heaving. Or here, where she's standing around the family in as little clothing as is possible in the 18th century without her just being naked. Although they do keep the camera at eye level throughout the entirety of the beach scene, which honestly I'm impressed and surprised by. And of course, who could forget this flipping shot when she's reading Mel's letter? In fact, there are a surprising number of times throughout this entire film when Charlotte's body is visible, but her head is just out of frame. And if, by some miraculous chance, there is ever a moment in which a woman in this film, any of them, aren't using their screen time to unconditionally and unwaveringly support their male counterpart, to be sexualized in some way, or to just stand around as a useless prop, or to suffer sometimes pretty horrific levels of violence in order to give us an excuse for the men to progress their own story, well then the best that we can hope for is for them to wistfully stare off into the distance while their men are riding away. Like, seriously, a significant portion of these two women's screen time is literally just them staring at men. Entire scenes passing by where they're saying nothing, doing nothing. Their entire character being boiled down to their relationships, their sexuality, to put it frankly, their obsession with the romantic counterparts, even though, again, we don't actually see anything that builds up these relationships. They just stare at them.
I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I am not the kind of person to cry misogyny at the drop of a hat. If anything, it's the sort of thing that people can obsess over to the point of being unhealthy, to the point that it creates unrealistic characters and overly idealized moments to ruin some pieces of media entirely. But the fact that some media overcompensates for things, or maybe that there are some crazy teenagers on TikTok that complain that everything under the sun is sexist or whatever, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Doesn't mean that sexism isn't a real problem in the world and something worth talking about. Sometimes movies are actually sexist. That is a thing that happens, and in this case, The Patriot isn't just some mindless popcorn entertainment. At its best, it's awfully written. And at its worst, it is a warped and disturbing vision of humanity being portrayed as an ideal. And when we treat this kind of propaganda as our popcorn entertainment, well then I would say there's a problem.
Thank you all for watching, particularly to those nobly inclined persons who have entered into patronage of the Native Oak on patreon.com. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.